Hello, everybody. Today I'm joined by Tim from Firelock Games, and we're going to be sitting down and talking about one of their new upcoming RPGs, Under the Black Sail. So, Tim, it's a pleasure to have you on the channel.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
So, before we get into the nitty-gritty of why we're here and talk about the game, the setting that you're working on at the moment, first off, can you tell us a bit about yourself, where you've come from in the sort of gaming hobby and industry?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started a long time ago with Dungeons and Dragons back in the 8th grade, and it's kind of hooked me back then in gaming. Got into Warhammer from there. And then, pretty much stayed in the hobby side of it, just being the gamer up until about 2014, where I was helping out at conventions and things like that. And I was actually offered a job by Cool Mini or Not, which is now come on. And at the time, I was the sales and marketing manager over there for a while. And then I've worked with multiple other companies throughout the years. So currently, I'm actually sales and marketing for multiple companies within the gaming industry, Firelock being one of them. And I've also done design work on multiple different games as well. So I helped out with some design and play test back in the day of my CMON days with Dark Age, also Wrath of Kings. And then I also wrote the series Ragnarok, Heavy Metal Combat, and the Viking Age, and the 2 books that followed that for Osprey. And here I am writing role-playing game material for Firelock Games.
It's a varied approach to the hobby, which I can wholeheartedly appreciate, because it's very similar to my own, sort of coming at it from every direction at once.
Yes.
So when writing an RPG, then this is your sort of your first big expansive look at a rule set then, is it?
Yeah, so for a role-playing game, this is my first time doing it solo, right? Like I've done some bits and pieces for different games in the past, but this is my first one really diving in and doing everything mostly on my own. Obviously, Firelock Games, we work with historians, so there's a lot of stuff that they send my way that I take into consideration when putting it back into the writing and, things of that nature. They also have just written direct parts for the game that help make it a little bit more sense. So, but I mean, as far as like the bulk of the matter, it is me creating the charts and the tables and everything else that goes along with it, making the rules make sense.
The unsung hero.
Yeah. Very much so.
So obviously the pirate age is not unknown to Firelock.
Correct.
When the decision was made to have an RPG set in and around that era as well, was this something that they came to you to work on, or was this something that you wanted to work on and asked Firelock whether or not they would be interested? Because it's a bit of a departure game-wise, going from miniature-based tabletop to RPGs.
Yeah, absolutely. So it came about organically, I guess is the best way to put it. Ever since Blood and Plunder came out, there's been a lot of people that have been looking for campaign rules for Blood and Plunder. And we've done different things over the years to cater to that and do things of that nature. And over time, people were asking for more and more and more, to the point to where people were like, I really want to play a role-playing game set in the Blood and Plunder universe, which is history. And we've talked about it back and forth. We've gone back and forth on it quite a few times. I actually started running early demos of Under the Black Sail back in 2018. So this has been
bubbling under
bits
the
and
surface
pieces,
for a while,
bubbling under the surface, yes, for quite some time. And this is the first time that we're really getting a chance to bring it to the surface and really just let people see it for what it's going to be, which is the ability to play a historical-based RPG during the Golden Age of Piracy. Obviously, for those of you that are not familiar with Firelock Games, we are probably the most historically accurate company out there for gaming when it comes time to anything during this period of piracy. So we work with professional historians, Benderson Little being one of them, to make sure that we are factually correct on not only garb, but what weapons people would have had, how they would have acted, different things that would have happened throughout history, also ripping apart some of the pirate legend. Obviously during that time period, there was a lot of romanticism that was thrown around. Good example of this, and this is probably going to hurt a few people's images, but we don't actually know if Blackbeard put wicks in his beard and lit his beard on fire, because that would have just been completely hazardous and probably would have killed him.
Yeah.
We do know that he was one of the original beard hipsters, so he was very good at taking care of his beard and putting bows in it. But as far as lighting the cannon wicks and sticking it under his hat and all of those things that we've kind of grown used to hearing, that part we're like, we're not certain if that happened. We do know, obviously, with the syphilis, it was driving him crazy and things of that nature. We just don't think it drove him, well, from accounts, we don't know if it drove him that crazy.
Sure.
Right. So it's kind of, it's always a balancing act when you're getting into those pieces of history. Like, you don't want to take away people's visions of it, but at the same time, you want to portray reality as much as possible. So,
it's an interesting one as well, because for this period, when you say Golden Age, do you run from the Buccaneering period all the way through to the sort of the 1720s, or is it very specifically the?
Yeah,
because I know Black Powder, Blood and Plunder is focused towards the sort of early to middle period, but hasn't really gone post Spanish Succession yet.
That is correct. So actually, with Raise the Black, which is our Kickstarter we just did, that is actually going to be moving up into Queen Anne's War and beyond, to basically when England comes in and says, you know what, enough of this piracy stuff, it's done, and pretty much squashes piracy almost overnight, just by the fact that they start rolling in with massive ships of the line that the pirates just can't handle,
can't compete with.
So so when it comes time to things like that, the book will cover, for ease of entry for people that want to run different periods, it's actually going to cover the early history all the way up until basically the end of piracy as we know it. And I use that term very loosely there.
Sure.
But as far as where people see it as like the defining end of what people see as piracy at that time, that, that's where the book is going to go. So you'll be dealing with a lot of the early pirates as well, such as Francois Launay, Manuel Riviere de Pardal, John Morris, Henry Morgan, and then of course you will see your Charles Vane, Blackbeard, all Black Caesar, Jack Rackham and Bonnie Mary Reed, all the ones that a lot of people know, which is the later era piracy. You're going to get all of that in the book. So it's up to you as the game master and your player base as to what portion within that history you want to play.
Sure.
And we've got so many bullet points and so many different things, even within the chronology in the book, that give you so many adventure hooks to where you can do so much within that time period.
Well, let's just talk about the book itself then. So what sort of amount of the book is given over to the era and history of it? So are you looking at over half is set up and giving people the details and hooks to get into it, and then scenarios and campaigns and characters and the like with very small amount of mechanics in there, or is it more equally split? What sort of way have you been approaching it?
I would say it's probably a 60-40, 60% history, 40% rules, just because of, and with rules, I am also counting examples of play and things of that nature in there as well. When we initially set out to do this role-playing game, we really wanted this to be a history book with rules should you choose to want to play the game in that way. Sure. Right? Obviously, it's still a role-playing game, but we wanted to focus on the history part of it too, just in order to really give people like a good tome of the history in everything that happened within that time period, to really spark people's imaginations. So yes, there's a lot of history within the books. It's all factually correct as far as what we know from records and what historians have been able to tell us. So there's a lot of history. There's a lot of the various cultures in there, between like how Spanish view the rest of the world, how English view the rest of the world, how the French view the rest of the world. Obviously we have unaligned and peripheral powers within the book. We saw a little bit of that within Blood and Plunder. That's being expanded upon a little bit in order to breathe some extra life into that. Because again, we are playing a role-playing game that is essentially the world as we know it. We want to stick to the history, but we don't want anybody to feel excluded because we just wrote a little blurb. But at the same time, if the history is just not there, we're not going to make stuff up, I guess, for lack of better terms.
Sure.
Just to
flesh it out. Yeah.
Yeah, just to flesh it out.
It's one of those periods where everybody knows about pirates,
Mhm.
but very few people actually know anything about pirates. You know,
Right.
we're so much as modern media, or when I say modern media, even go back to Errol Flynn,
Yeah.
Hollywood and TV have constantly represented pirates and piracy in a very over the top, almost semi fantastical
Yeah.
way, and you don't need that in an RPG that's set like this when you've already got so many incredibly interesting points of the history that just sort of get lost. Things like the Pirate Republic of Nassau, which I imagine is right in there.
Oh yeah.
Having this democratic hub for pirates, separate from the rest of the world's empires, is in and of itself intriguing place to go to and to start adventures off from.
Yeah, especially when you look at the fact that, if we really break it down, like the idea of the heroic pirate is such a romanticized thought. Like most of the people, a good example of this, when they started setting everything up within the Pirate Republic, like people need to understand that, like, if you became a pirate or a privateer in any way, you were at your core a scumbag. Right. So it's not exactly like you were an upstanding citizen. Sure, you may still have wanted to get on the good graces with England, but it's not exactly like you were doing that in the most honest ways possible. Right. So there's a lot of pieces of the history that, I guess we want to dispel some of the romanticism. So yes, the Republic, the Pirate Republic, for a good example of that. Yes, that happened, but we also know there was a lot of infighting. There was a lot of people that were swapping crews. There were, people that were probably killed for slights along the way. Be it just they had a disagreement, and so instead of dealing with it via the vote, they took it out back, and one person ended up taking a knife to the ribs a few times while nobody was looking. So again, the democratic vote still stood, but a lot of the decisions were made outside of that democratic vote as well.
It's one way to go, certainly.
Yeah.
I suppose also because you've got this, when you're playing some RPGs, you'll often find that some people want to play female characters, and they're almost having to be shoehorned into positions where they wouldn't exist normally. But you don't have that issue with piracy, and certainly there were several very famous female pirates, some of which even managed to avoid being killed at the end of their career. So having things like that as well means that you can have diverse player groups as well within the game without it pulling you out of the realism of the period that you're trying to portray.
Yeah. In the funny part of that is too, is when a lot of people think of pirates, they, not to dive too much into the diversity side of it as a whole, but it is a very diverse time period. There's reason to believe that at one point the Brethren of the Coast, which was formed by Henry Morgan and some other folks around the time period, about 20% of the Brethren of the Coast and the pirates that formed the Brethren of the Coast were of African descent or minorities that were either escaped slaves or freed slaves. And so let's talk about freed slaves. They were slaves on a ship, and they basically had a choice: either get sold over here as slaves or join us for pay. Right. So let's not shy away from the fact that horrible things like that happen, but they were given a choice at that point. And the moment you were made a member of the crew, like, that's it. You were a member of the crew, which means you were entitled to the shares on any type of a raid or anything else that you did. You had voting rights. You had all the different things that went along with how piracy was performed back in the days. Most people don't realize, but pirates actually had hazard pay. For the most part, they had hazard pay and sick pay, and in leave for injuries. So
it's better than a lot of people get today. Let's face it.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's one of those things, because a lot of captains realize it's like, look, I can be a completely ruthless, bloodthirsty piece of work, and if my crew isn't taken care of, then I'm not going to have a crew, right? Yeah. So I'm not going to sit here and say that they did this out of the kindness of their hearts, but it was also out of necessity. Like, I need fighting people. I need people to fight on my side. Someone who's willing to pick up a pistol and go rob these boats over here or these colonies in order to get things.
Sure. And the minute you start treating them badly, then there's plenty of other ships and plenty of other captains that will take them on instead.
Yeah, well, you know, and the other side of it is too, we are talking real life, right? So as much as we always want to, you know, picture these larger than life swashbucklers that can fight off 20 people at once, from a reality standpoint, that wouldn't happen. The moment you get involved in a sword fight with more than one other person, your odds have just they've gone straight to the toilet. And of course, there's also the fact that, like, sure, captain quarters are great, but if somebody, you know, 10 or 15 crew members kick in your door in the middle of the night and decide to stab you in your sleep, well, that's a thing. Yeah. So, you know, people were very aware of how flesh and blood they were back then. And that's something that we're also dealing with in the mechanics of the game as well. You know, this is not, I don't want to give anybody the wrong impression of the kind of role-playing game this is, right? Like, this is not a high fantasy, high heroism, swinging across rope decks while shooting a pistol and landing and stabbing 3 people with your cutlass type of RPG. This is very much, if you get shot once, there's a good chance that you're dead or you're exceedingly injured. So we're trying to really lean into the harsh portions of history on that. And one of the ways that we do get around that is the fact that one of the big pieces of mechanics that we have in the game is actually crew. So you'll have your main characters, and then you and the rest of the players will sit down and create your crew, which are basically people that your characters know personally, either that are on your same ship or in your same stronghold, or people, you know, it kind of falls into that I know a guy who knows a guy mentality. And so if your main character gets injured and they're out for, say, a month because they're digging a musket ball out of their shoulder and their right arm is just completely jacked and they're going to be in a sling for a month and are going to be effective, you know, essentially ineffective, you as the player, instead of just sitting there on your phone waiting for your turn, you can just take over as one of the crew members. And now that crew member becomes your character as your main character heals up, should that crew member be around.
That's a nice touch. It gives you I suppose a wealth of backup player characters. And when you're playing with a system that is as deadly as Year Zero can be, it's probably not a bad idea to have a few of those on standby. It also makes it much easier to introduce replacement characters, because in a lot of other games, when somebody dies, then all of a sudden the other 3 party members going, oh, and here's Miriam. She was just over there. She knows you. She's going to join in now. Whereas, having the actual crew be living people on board your ship and therefore available is a great way of doing it. Yeah,
and the crew does serve a lot of purposes too, right? So when a character becomes a crew, or when a crew character is part of that collective, they're just that, a collective. So that means that, you know, if I'm playing, you know, one of the examples I have in the book is a priest named Father Barnard, right? So if I play him, you know, I've got basically everything should be able to fit on about roughly the size of a Post-it note when it comes time to the crew characters in order for them to be able to be used.
Yeah, it's broad strokes.
It's broad strokes. And then, of course, like, I might develop his personality and make him a heavy drinker, or, you know, whatever else may be in there. And, you know, so the next time that you play him, you might have that cue, oh, Father Barnard is a heavy drinker. And then you decide to give him an accent, or you decide to give him a limp in his step from the last battle he had, or, you know, he was involved in a fight and, you know, took a shot to the leg or something along those lines. So over time, just like your main characters, you as the group help develop the personality of these crew members. And because as your characters improve, the crew members will improve as well. And so it gives you more of like a, you know, kind of going into an acting side of it, if you want to call it that, more of an improv, like a collective improv for these characters.
Well, does that feature into the mechanics then? Because Year Zero is a relatively simple system. If people aren't aware of it, it's a D6 and you need to roll a 6 to be successful. But you can sometimes tweak that by adding equipment or gear in and things like that. So does
mechanically none of that changes.
Okay. But then do you add in things like, is there ship-to-ship combat? And does that improve or change depending on how your crew have developed, or is it always like a set sort of thing going on there?
So your crew will have a lot of different functions on that. So, kind of diving into the crew as kind of a detail. Again, we're talking more along the lines of a real life setting, right? So
Sure.
just like in real life, you don't know everything.
Yeah.
There's people out there that are going to know computers far better than you. There's going to be people out there that know how to, sail a boat. There's going to be people that know how to use certain weaponry better than you can. There's math, pottery, skills are all over the place.
Sure.
And we've kind of gotten used to this idea in role-playing games over the years that like my character is really good at these things, but he's good at pretty much everything, right? Because it's that whole heroism as I go.
Exactly.
And because this is more of a real life, your crew serves in a lot of different ways. So if you're playing like some Dutch drunken bar brawler who's not good at social interactions, and you're about to go have dinner with a governor, you may not want to play your main character in that scene unless you're just really wanting to throw a monkey wrench into the whole into the whole bit. So then you might take, in this case, Father Barnard, who's better at speaking and those kind of engagements, and that will be your character for the scene. So that way, as a player, you never sit out, and you always, in a way, have those needed fill-in points. So, and that also works in ship-to-ship and mass combat, which all falls under the same portion, right? So, with ships, they're very easily developed, and you can actually sit down and, so ships fall under a category in the role-playing game, which is just stronghold, right? So it's kind of a catch-all term. That could be a ship. It could be a reinforced storage house on the inside of a bar. It could be an actual fortress. It could be a bungalow in the woods surrounded by booby traps. It's entirely up to you and your other players as to what your stronghold, and as you get better and probably get more money, strongholds look like. So, and the more that you develop into them, the more cues they will have, which is another big part of the system, which kind of says like, okay, well, this stronghold has 2 medium cannons and has reinforced walls, right? Where before it was just like, it was the shack in the woods. Well, now we've added reinforced walls and these 2 medium cannons on the hill. So, over time, your strongholds can get better based upon the things that you add to it or subtract. Just same thing as it would in real life. You take out a sloop and it goes up against a galleon and it gets really shot. It gets really shot up and loses a bunch of stuff.
You sell that for firewood and get yourself a new ship.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a lot of different things that take into consideration with that. And again, here your characters are not these people that can do everything. So part of that is in mass battles and ship combat and things like that. You will actually have a certain amount of orders that you can give to the other crew members, either be it in assisting you in what you're doing, or just like quick fire. You should be able to say them in like 15 to 20 seconds. Like the crew is going to do this. They're going to go and man the light guns on, the starboard side, and they're going to just give a full barrage to the enemy ship. Or like I'm assigning certain crew members and you're assigning certain crew members to go put out a massive fire that's about to spread into the powder room that needs to get put out right now. Yeah. So, and if we don't have the crew members or they're injured, things are going to go bad. Yeah. So, and all that's taken into consideration. So there's, every stronghold has zones and things like that are kind of fall within it. So there's zones as we know it within the year zero engine, right? Which is kind of like melee range, short range, medium range, long range, extreme range. And then of course, very similar to buildings, right? So like a ship will have a certain amount of zones. It doesn't mean that like, oh, I'm in this zone, you're in that zone, I'm immediately long range. No, it just means that in order for me to be effective there, I might need to spend actions to get from my zone to your zone, or send crew from my zone to your zone, right? It's just like in real life. Like I can't do everything. I'm not the Flash. I'm not Superman. I can't be in another spot immediately.
It just gives people an idea of where they are relative to what else is happening on board the ship or in a fortress or in a town or whatever it happens to be.
Yes,
it's a nice little feature.
So, and the development of the rules on that is probably the hardest part, because of the fact that with role-playing games especially, you have to always take it from the golden rule that it needs to be played within the mind's eye. As much as like having miniatures and terrain and everything else is absolutely fantastic to have, the world's still coming out of COVID at this point, right? So we're still used to playing on Discord or over Zoom or things of that. So we need to be able to do it based upon things we have written down on paper and just memory. So trying to develop the rules that feel granular and, in a lot of ways grandiose enough to portray that, but also not be over the top bookkeeping or feel that you need miniatures to represent that is, that's the balancing point on that right now.
Yeah, I can assume that a lot of time and effort is going into that because personally, I'm not a fan of miniatures in role-playing games anyway. But I know some people are, each to their own. But finding that balance where you're not having to go, well, we have 50 people, 4 of them are in this zone, 17 of them are in that. You end up spending more time trying to work out where everything is and everybody is doing something, and all of a sudden you drain the life out of the actual adventure, and that's very tricky. So have you had to do much with the Year Zero engine? Have you added much to it then, or has it just been sort of light strokes because it's a very easy thing to graft onto?
Yeah, so with our system, mostly because of the fact that we are grounded in reality, the biggest pieces are the use of crew, the stronghold mechanics, which I know that they do have similar things within Forbidden Lands. As far as like they've already kind of had that within the system. Ours is slightly different just because of the fact that, again, we're not heroes, we're people that have multiple other people to think about. And then of course, so the crew, strongholds, and then the queue system that I've talked a few times about, which is a big piece of the system. And really the queue system, where it may look complicated in the book, is really not. It looks complicated only because there's a lot of pages dedicated to it, but it's really there to give you a monstrous pile of examples of how the queue system can work. So queues in the game are anything that, would be relevant to your character that really just leads back to, between it's the balance between storytelling and how that affects the game, right? So good example of that, the queue on the ship might be that, your hull took a barrage of cannon fire and knocked over a lantern inside of the powder room. Well, somebody better go take care of the powder room, or your ship is about to have a very massive problem on its hands. So that's a queue, right? Now, what is that? So the way that the queue system works is based upon the severity of damage taken, based upon any type of banes or other triggers that may have happened during that scene. Instead of the game master having to keep track of like all these modifiers all over the place, it's just the queue is powder room on fire. Depending upon like how severe the queue was, it might be you have 2 rounds to put it out. So powder room on fire, 2 rounds to put it out, or this, right? And so what it does is it allows the GM to take all these moving pieces within a complex scene, such as a mass battle or ship combat or things like that, and really just
sort of drill down to the necessities.
Necessities that can be put on a Post-it note and stuck somewhere behind the desk or somewhere behind the screen. So the idea of it is that it does it add a bit of bookkeeping? Yes. In any type of a mass battle, there's going to be some of that. However, that can also be shared amongst the players, because if the players know, hey, the powder room's on fire, instead of the GM keeping track of that, he could be like, you have 2 rounds to put that out, because the players would know that too. So now that becomes a piece of bookkeeping for the players as well, to go, oh, we've got 2 rounds to put that out. By the way, they're about to pull up and we're about to get a full barrage. They broke two of the masts on the ship, right? So these are all cues where it's like how they add to the overall story outside of did we win, did we lose, right? Because there's so much more in reality than, win or lose.
Yeah, things are rarely as clear cut.
Correct. Yeah. So that's where ultimately where the queue system comes in, and that applies not only to the mass battles but also on your characters as well. So part of those cues is you take enough physical damage. It might be that your leg was crushed at one point. So that detrimental physical cue is the fact that yes, your agility has been permanently reduced by 1 and you cannot run. Right. So that is a cue on the character that you gain. That's a more extreme one, but it could also be along the lines of, you took a nasty shock through the arm, and it happens to be your sword arm. Well, you can still fight, but it's going to take you, about a good month to heal and work your arm back to normal. Otherwise, like, you might have to switch to fighting with your left hand. So it's things like that where it adds to the characters, it gives the simple modifiers, but there's also a reason why those modifiers are there.
Sure. Speaking about characters, a lot of people who are familiar with role-playing games will be familiar with sort of archetypes or various classes. Even people who aren't familiar with RPGs will probably know the barbarian, elf, rogue, and dwarven warrior, that sort of thing. With a game like this, where it is focused in reality and you don't have clearly defined classes, do you have even things like archetypes in here, or is it more focused on you are a person and it's these cues that over time will develop that character and change how they behave and appear to other people, or is there still some form of archetypes within the sort of the character generation?
So the archetype through character generation kind of comes in through your backgrounds. So every player, and this is entirely up to the game master how they handle this. We actually have it set up because your backgrounds are essentially affect who your character are up until day one, where effectively you take over their body as the player and you direct their life from there forward, right? So the backgrounds, I encourage that they're randomly generated, right? Because you don't determine how you're born, what kind of early life you had. You might have found a different vocation along the way that you kind of got into that led to who you are now. So your backgrounds will help develop who you were leading up to now. So it does. So in a way, it builds a bit of an archetype into it based upon like, you're going to have certain boosts to attributes. You're going to have certain boosts to skills. You'll have a couple of different traits based upon, what your backgrounds looked like that lead until the point to where effectively you are that character. So you can use that and kind of say, okay, well, my second background was was a thug. Right. So what does that look like? Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and join this crew of people over here because I really like just beating people up and taking their stuff. Right. So you kind of lean into that second portion of your background, or it might be like, no, I was an orphan on the streets. I was a thug. You spend some of your other skill points in becoming a much better speaker, and you're trying to be a better person. Right. It might be that you are a reformed criminal who's trying to become a priest, or is trying to get into good graces with the local militia and join the militia, right? So these are all things that are built into the character, because we've also got short-term goals and long-term goals that will also help boost your character along too. So these are all things to think about when making the character. It's not just, I am pirate, give me pistol, give me cutlass, let me swing to ship and kill things, right? So it's and that's probably the one thing that like we haven't really touched upon yet that I did want to mention within the game, right? Is like when most people think a pirate RPG, they think the Yar, Army, Hardy, and all the things I just mentioned, right? And
there'll be so many Jack Sparrow impersonations.
Yes, 100%. And so now, like, the other thing to think about is like there is so much more of the world. So like this encompasses the world. Your whole Under the Black Sail campaign may never take place at sea. You all might be members of a local militia, right? So that's all things to think about when you're creating your characters. And like, of course, there's always this session 0 with the GM to discuss those things. But there's no saying that you have to be somebody who's ever stepped foot on a ship, right? You could be playing a native who's never seen a gun in their life, and the first time one goes off, they don't know what is going on. Like they're very good at sneaking around. They maybe just learned some very crude, rudimentary version of English or French, depending upon what European colony settled in there, right? But they may have never seen a gun in their life. So the first time a gun goes off, this is essentially magic to them. This is something that the gods created, whatever that may be. So that, again, we have to take all that into consideration when making the game. You're not just a, Yarmy Hardy pirate. Like, you can be literally anything. You could be a noble that has landed in the New World, or like, somebody who's there to, make a change, and then you just become a complete bastard along the way and change it up.
As is their want in life. Well, it's one way of doing it.
Exactly.
But that's very interesting right there, because and it's something that people often forget, because you often hear about like pilgrims step off the boat and then they're greeted in the New World, and the I think one of the very first interactions they had with the natives there was a native who came up to them and spoke to them in English because he had been on a ship and had traveled back and forth, because there's a big gap between Columbus arriving and then the sort of the age of piracy. But
yeah, about 200 years.
Yeah, so there was a lot of traffic back and forth, and even having things like having Native Americans who've served aboard ship and then have decided just to retire back. You can have these unusual characters develop that people possibly ordinarily wouldn't think about as well, simply because of the way it goes. Talking about the stories then briefly, you were saying that you've got like sort of bullet point type hooks in there. Are there any main stories or scenarios to give people a sort of here's an example scenario that you can play for the first time, or is it more or less left to people to create within the world that they have?
Yeah, so there's going to be one example scenario that's put in the book, and that's the Oro Savalle, which stands for Savage Gold, which, in a lot of ways people can take as a bit offensive, but at the same time, it does, the title lends itself to that period, right?
Sure.
And so essentially, there's some Spanish that ended up taking some what other people believe to be gold, but like goods and artifacts from some local tribes of Dairen. And so you basically find out where the Spanish are, do a little bit of intel, and then you go and take the stuff or return it. And again, you're playing pirates, you kind of do what you want to do there. Yeah. But the whole idea of it is it's a pocket scenario that gets people used to playing the game, where it's going to have ample time for interactions of different kinds, to get used to some of the social and mental mechanics of the game. And then, of course, there's also a lot of the physical mechanics of the game that also happens when you decide to take on the Spanish, or whatever that looks like, be it, stealth, be it just run and gun, throwing grenades on board the ship. And again, it's set up simple enough to where there's going to be multiple different outcomes based upon how the players want to interact in that way. But there's enough meat on the bones to get you started. So I like to look at it as a more of a healthy appetizer type of intro scenario to get going.
Sure.
And then from there, that should give you enough to really take it and be like, okay, well, let's bump it back in the time period a little bit, or let's bump it forward. And, we want to do like the exact start of the Pirate Republic, right? Like Robert Hornigold landing and, saying, nope, we're taking over here. And, just starting from, so it's entirely up to the player base. But yes, there is a starting intro adventure that will, again, the whole idea is to help a game master who may have never game mastered any other game before jump in, run this adventure, conclude this adventure, and then inspire the players to either one of them takes over as a game master, or the game master continues to go farther from there. And ultimately, the cool thing with history too, right, is like, yes, we have a lot of history written into the book, and we have hundreds of bullet points, even within chapter 2, that just deals with the whole chronology of piracy, that you could take those bullet points and turn them into adventures, or even some of them full-blown campaigns.
Sure.
And you as the game master and the players can dive into that section of history a bit more, learn more about it, and really use that to amplify your games. In a lot of ways, people find that truth is stranger than fiction. We all like, your orcs and elves and fantasy and barbarians and wizards and all of that. But when you look back at certain portions of history and see what really happened, you also look at it and go, that was odd.
Yeah.
I can't believe that worked the way that it happened.
I think that's one thing a lot of people find when they start delving into the history of any period, is that there's always something in there that you would just go, if I'd seen that as a Hollywood film, or if I'd read that as a novel, you would just think this is the worst kind of trash. At no point would that ever have happened. But then you can point to it and go, but it did happen. And those are the people involved. And I think that's one of the fantastic things about having an RPG set within a real world historical time period, that people can explore and see just exactly what was going on and how it was developing and happening.
Yeah. Because it also allows you to introduce different characters and different things like that. Again, depending upon the time frame you want to fall within. Yeah. It allows you to introduce different characters and different legendary people around that time period, and that's something that I did want to touch upon as well, real quick. when it comes time to the legendary people from that time period, right? We emphasize that ultimately it is your role-playing game, right? So if you make friends with Henry Morgan, great. If you shoot Francois Lolonet in the face, well, in your game, effectively, he's dead. So the rest of history of Francois Lolonet from your game is effectively gone, right?
Sure.
A lot of people have this idea when it comes time to RPGs that are based upon history or anything that's like a major intellectual property, that anything that they do is effectively, it's inconsequential, right? Like I've heard this argument before, and again, this is not a knock on the RPG, but like any Star Wars role-playing game, right?
Yeah.
They're like, well, we went to the movies to see Luke, Leia, and Han, and or in the case of the new ones like Kylo Ren and Rey and Finn. Like we went to the movies to see them. I don't care about what's going on in this other planets over here, right? Like this is the main story, and we didn't want people to feel that like anything that their characters do, because they're not playing Henry Morgan, or they're not playing,
it becomes inconsequential simply because they're not the famous people.
Right. So we wanted to emphasize on that it's like, yes, you are playing within the annals of history, but that does not mean that for your game you can't change history, right? Like if you shoot Francois Lolonet directly in the face and kill him immediately, well, now he is no longer this complete psychopath that is rampaging through the world, right? So it's like you're able to you're playing within history, but you're not.
It's a stepping off point for the story. It's not a railroad. People aren't being railroaded to follow history slavishly. Then
right, and that's something that we actually do touch upon in the book, and that also goes along with the fact that history is also a very dark and nasty place that was filled with a lot of awful people. And, so we do take care in the role-playing game as well to make sure that yes, we are putting things we are putting information into the book that is there specifically because of the fact it was a piece of history.
Sure.
Ultimately, again, we're talking slavery and, just overall xenophobia and racism and everything that happened back then. These are all awful atrocities. It is entirely up to you and the game master in the group as to what of those pieces of content you want to include, if at all.
Sure.
Right. So we didn't. It's always hard because when we know that stuff went on back then, there's a tendency for people to think it's like, oh, well, this is just giving awful people a reason to play a game and continue to be awful people. It's like, no, not really. We want to give you the completeness of history for what it was, but how mature you make the content or what content you choose to put in is entirely onto you and your player base.
Yeah, you're at the end of the day, you are playing a game with a group of people, and it sort of comes out. It's a shared experience, so you don't want to specifically ostracize anybody, but at the same time, you don't want to force people to play with something that they may feel uncomfortable with, which I think is a valid point. So, do you know when Under the Black Sail is going to be available for people, and how are Firelock going to be bringing it out then? Is it going to come to Kickstarter, or is it going into retail? Or
so this will not come to Kickstarter. This is actually going to be coming via a pre-order and then directly into retail.
Okay.
So we decided that with this project, and obviously our other role-playing game that we're working on, War Stories, our World War II game, these are going to go directly into retail via pre-order. So we're going to have a big pre-order campaign up on our website and everything else, so people can pre-order the books. And then from there, once it's printed and done, the people that pre-ordered get their book copies, and then the rest goes directly into retail. So stay tuned for more information on that. But as far as the release date, we should see both games out by end of year.
Okay.
I have actually, at this point, this last Friday, turned in a 255-page playtest document to my playtesters out there.
I'm sure they love to see that coming into their email boxes. There you go. Enjoy this.
I had a couple people print it out, and they're like, yeah, this is a monster. I'm like, well, you guys wanted a full RPG. You're getting it. So obviously it's not completely done yet. There's going to be, editing, things like that. We might have to put some extra examples in the book in order to flesh out certain things, just to make sure that people are getting a good grasp of how certain rules work. But it's all there. Effectively, with the rules right now, there's nothing stopping you from going in and just developing the game and playing a full-on RPG. There's just, there's some stuff that's not completely fleshed out yet. That, again, it's like anything else. Like, it always makes sense in your head when you're writing it, but that doesn't mean it's going to make sense to everybody else when they read it.
Well, that's feedback, they tell me, is a gift.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully we'll get some time where I can corral Warren and Free and maybe Ben or Justin and get a run through of the game with you. We'll record that and get it out into the big wide world for people to see. In the meantime, if there's any questions anybody has out there about Under the Black Sail, pop them below and I'll forward them on to Tim, and we will keep you abreast of what Firelock are up to and closer to the time when the pre-order is about to launch. But until then, it's been a pleasure having a chat with you, Tim.
Go ahead and check out our other content on screen now. And while you're at it, why not hit subscribe and remember to ding our dong. Go on, you know you want to click it. Go on.